The Rings of Power is the most expensive show ever made, with an overall budget of $1 billion. Despite that, only 37% of viewers made it through to the end of the first season, with the second debuting with only half of that. The show was not bringing customers to Amazon Prime. There is little to no merch, virtually no cosplay at cons, and no cultural footprint. Rather than appeal to a long-standing, devoted fanbase who might be willing to shepherd in a new audience, Amazon went in the other direction, infusing the show with modernity. On its own terms, it sucks. Compared to Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings, it sucks enough ass to cause a colonic hemorrhage.
Was that a joke?
Yep.
That's pretty good.
The Lord of the Rings trilogy is fantasy in the truest sense, because it is on an epic scale, because it has the romance of a quest, and because it's fun. There is the thrill of adventure, of camaraderie among endearing characters, and a charming spirit to the whole thing. Absolutely nothing about the Rings of Power is fun, or charming, or has any spirit. Not the stoic characters, not the sluggish pacing, not the directionless drifting, nor the multiple plot threads, nor the girl bossery, nor the interpersonal sniping, nor the contrived eccentricity, nor the motivations or decisions, or goodies, or baddies, or fight scenes, or mystery boxes. Never does it bring Middle-earth to life, not for one miserable second. In The Lord of the Rings, the elves are a sequestered, ethereal race, used sparingly, with an equanimity and otherworldly quality that was faintly intimidating. They were never quite relatable, with an aloofness that came from sheer age, having seen so many epochs come and go, and beyond much of the pettiness, impulsiveness, and folly of common men. Watching the films, there was a strong sense of being in another realm, with a more refined species. In The Rings of Power, the elves are a bunch of lame-ass, dim-witted, very mundane, very human-acting twats who get everything ass backwards, keep tripping over their own asses, squabble and bicker, lack patience and shrewdness, and harbor resentments. All stuff that beings who are thousands of years old should have grown out of, I don't know, half a millennia ago. Celebrimbor is the easiest mark in history, manipulated and prone to drearily human insecurities and frets. Gil-galad is a mediocre and ponderous leader. Elrond is effete and lightweight. Arondair is a preposterous Middle-earth Jean-Claude Van Damme, and Galadriel is insufferable, smug and conceited. There is nothing charming or ethereal about these elves. They have no wisdom. They all suck. The Lord of the Rings reflected some of Tolkien's experience of World War I, the muck of the trenches, the smoke and splintered trees of the Somme, with battles such as Helm's Deep standing among the most kinetic and enthralling set pieces in literature and on the screen. The Rings of Power has mostly featured episodic little battles, often detached from the plot, with no sense of marauding mass and scale, no particular stakes, and Galadriel looking like a douchebag swirling around performing acrobatics on the backs of horses, and ripping whole swarms of orcs to shreds, like anyone gives a shit, except for the lame and flaky writers. In The Lord of the Rings, masculinity is coherent within a medieval world of hierarchies, harsh labor, clan skirmishes and war, distant journeys, and the severity of the elements. With this are the verities of loyalty, camaraderie, and destiny. The characters comport themselves as men in such an environment. A character like Boromir, with a stubborn pride, becomes compelling in that his corruption and giving into weakness becomes his undoing, and his redemption at his death is extremely poignant. Aragorn, beginning as Strider, undergoes perhaps an even greater arc, from diffidence and obscurity to earning respect and recognition, and ultimately rising to his destiny as a fully realized ideal man and heir. In The Rings of Power, masculinity is a ball-retracting cringe fest. Most of the men are tosspots who mainstream men would find a little benign, tedious, excitable, and pussyish, with no particular masculine stature, centeredness, subdued ironies, or common sense, who are in fact, for the most part, indistinguishable in gender, in outlook, or manner, and are often overshadowed by the plucky, assertive, and even staunch chicks. In place of heft or physical presence, the men are, in the main, androgynous, slender creatures, more suited to the catwalk at a Milan fashion show than the toil and travails of Middle-earth. The Lord of the Rings has the enticement of mysticism. What is withheld and left to the imagination is of almost as much worth to the experience as what is shown. Wizard orders, occult power, tiers of beings in Middle-earth, unknowable inner worlds and mastery of forces, ancient lineages, and with things beyond the known reaches of the world left to the imagination, things full of portent and mystery, ancient leviathans residing and stirring in the depths. In the Rings of Power, you get bog snakes that spurt out of the mire, then get sliced apart, and barrow wights that appear in a forest, fling some chains around, then get their spectral asses kicked within a minute of having hove into view out of the gloom of a spooky forest. Almost everyone are plain and boring assholes, irrespective of whatever power they might wield. Sauron or Halbrand or whatever guise he has taken in his lurching, poorly synced timeline doesn't impress in the slightest, and as Anatar, we're more bemused and impatient than impressed. The writers worsen this by placing so few obstacles in his way. He is scarcely thwarted, never for long. There is a tedious sense of deferred inevitability, for him and for us. There are no revelatory moments of his cunning, things we hadn't accounted for, or sense of satisfaction in dividing and conquering, with weighted risk and audacious gambits raising him to the next phase of his schemes. Which means there isn't much dread or narrative tension. Never has a villain had such plain sailing or been so ahead of schedule. Great for him, tedious as all hell for us. In The Lord of the Rings, with The Quest, we understood what the main plot driver is. We understand the huge consequences if the Fellowship's journey is interrupted or the group is dispersed. With Nori and the Stranger, or Isildur and Arondir, there is no particular sense of consequences. No one is especially yearning to be home or drawn by powerful forces to get to their destination. It's just movement without any wider sense of progression. And the travels between destinations are weirdly ambiguous, distances uncertain, timelines unfathomable. There is a disproportionate amount of ambiguous objectives to clear objectives. The Lord of the Rings is replete with values. So much so that it causes a welling up of emotion as the epic unfolds. Simple values expressed unabashedly, in contrast to the bleakly relativist real world when we leave the cinema or switch off the TV. Valor, protecting the innocent, a higher purpose, morality, destiny, what distinguishes or redeems humanity from its darker impulses. Literal fellowship. There was the constant necessity and expression of sacrifice, characters protecting the more vulnerable and upholding a pledge to a greater purpose, even at the expense of forfeiting their own lives. Boromir protecting the hobbits, Gandalf plummeting to the depths with the Balrog, the small force at Helm's Deep willing to expend their lives in the face of hopeless odds. In the Rings of Power, there is no sense of values. Only plot entanglements, miscommunications, interpersonal relationships, and endless wandering across landscapes, so that characters are in literal geographic transition far more than they are in any more meaningful character transition. The Lord of the Rings was resplendent with themes: resilience, finding courage, realizing and accepting destiny, the idea that there is good in the world, the threat of corruption. The Rings of Power is a sterile and empty and desiccated show with no themes. No ideas are imparted to us. Just douchey people doing douchey things. In a douchey show, it's impossible to care about, because of its douchiness. In The Lord of the Rings, sensuality, tenderness, romantic yearning, and love were key to the wider expanse of conflict and stakes. The scenes between Aragorn and Arwen are achingly poignant, the masculinity and femininity expressed in a grown-up and authentic way by two perfectly cast actors. The score used sparingly, the framing very beautiful, and our investment assured. We cared ever more for Aragorn and the fate of Middle-earth because love was at stake. This love and tenderness extended to the familial. Perhaps the most tender moment of the trilogy is when Elrond, up till now aloof, terse, unknowable, disapproving, and even severe, asks of his daughter Arwen, "Do I too not have your love?" In the Rings of Power, Isildur is a beta cuck who gets cock-blocked after mooning over some plucky but underdeveloped new female character we don't care about. There is a scarcity of relationships or sense of attraction outside of Isildur's pussyish adolescent antics, an almost asexual emptiness which makes for an empty and dispiriting watch, as the fundamentals that make Middle-earth worth preserving are barely in evidence. Why should we care about these characters when they show so little profound care for each other? The Lord of the Rings understood that a fantasy world, influenced by Old English and Nordic lore and habitat, could be exotic, an important element of escapism, without having to imbue the world with modern diversity. The suspension of disbelief we allow for fantasy extends as far as Tolkien envisaged, and this suspension severs if you add in too many further credulity-stretching dynamics and elements. Multiculturalism is the feature of every tribe, village, and region in the modern version of Middle-earth. This is feeble and contrived in that it breaks suspension of disbelief if there is a semi-subterranean society in the middle of a remote desert landscape, peopled in prim and pedantic ratios of Asian, black, white, and Hispanic actors. It has you, at some latent level, facetiously speculating. How did South Korean, Indonesian, Somalian, and European people come to migrate or meet up in the middle of an arid landscape? Why did they travel from all over to be there originally? Why did they want to set up an egalitarian society there? Why is the windswept Southlands peopled by the same pedantically ratioed multicultural people as far-flung scorching hot climates? Why do they all speak English, with Dorset accents? Did they migrate indiscriminately, or were they all just born of random ethnicities from the very beginning, stretching back centuries? Do they ever stop to ponder the fact they look conspicuously of different ethnotypes? How have they not interbred over centuries to become a largely similar ethnotype? Or are we simultaneously supposed to be encouraged by the diversity and representation on screen, and, in a meta way, ultimately colorblind to the variety on screen? With a central quest, characters of all different backgrounds could form honorable and tender bonds. In the Rings of Power, no clusters of characters are forming honorable and tender bonds. The elves have a strange lack of intrinsic bonds among themselves. Ironically, one of the most emphasized familial and relationship bonds in the Rings of Power is the scarcely comprehensible embrace of an orc and his mate over their crooning baby. The Lord of the Rings had humor, simple, folksy, homely, unflecked by cynicism. Much of the humor derived from contrast between ancient and powerful figures and the hobbits. It was charming and brought off to great effect by the actors. In the Rings of Power, most people, most of the time, are grim, overly serious, pompous or frustrating. The comedy, rather than organic, is usually involving sudden, jarring set pieces that don't land, so that the show becomes an overwrought downer and a slog. The dwarves have a kind of cheery bonhomie among them, but we don't expect relatably profound bonds between them to strike any meaningful register with us as an audience. The problem was in forefronting the elves, when they just don't lend themselves to being at the forefront, because of their more elevated and aloof nature. The reality is, the writers can't write normal dialogue, and comedic content is entirely beyond them, because they suck, and their characters suck, and the show sucks. Amazon's The Rings of Power is a vanity project with no soul, a painful lack of originality, a conceited and clumsy imposition of modernity, and no joy, spirit, or sense of romantic adventure. It is a billion-dollar reaffirmation of the class and enduring legacy of Peter Jackson's trilogy. You can't buy heart, and you certainly can't buy ratings.